Good evening, everyone. It's very, very nice to have you here at this webinar again that is jointly organized by the Woolf Institute, by the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean, with the help of a few more partners, the CSIC IMF, the University of Munich, and the Medieval Studies Research Research Group at the University of Lincoln. And this term we also have a new partner, the Leicester Medieval Research Center, who are another new collaborator in this really exciting series of evening webinars. And I'll bring it to you. My name is Esther Wagner. I am the director of the Woolf Institute. And for those of you who don't know the Woolf Institute, we are a research institution in Cambridge. We focus on religion and society, and we combine our research with public education, with teaching, and with policy work. So please have a look at our website and our YouTube channels to find out more about our work. So now I'll put on my hat as the Vice President of the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean. The Society was founded in 1997, and it is dedicated to all aspects of the academic study of cross-cultural Mediterranean history and culture from the 5th to the 15th century. And this is also the moment to introduce the journal of the Society here, our beautiful journal Al-Mazak. The subscription of the journal comes with membership of the Society. So if you haven't joined the Society, but you would like to have a look at our webpage, you can find all about how to get this journal as your membership subscription. So have a look, it's really, really worth your while. So the very quick introduction to how this webinar works. We have a webinar audience and we also are live streaming via Facebook. So if you want to rewatch this or if you want to recommend it to anyone, then it is available on Facebook from after this webinar and also in a few days' time from the Woolf Institute YouTube channel. Our topic for today is the two sides of war economy, mobilization and allocation of resources in the medieval Mediterranean 1100 to 1500. I'm very, very excited about this topic. I was really looking forward to the webinar. And I'm going to introduce now the chair, Dr. Antonella Yutscopo, who will in turn introduce the speakers of today. And again, just sort of quickly running through the order of the webinar. The panelists will present and then we'll have a short discussion among themselves while you can prepare questions for the Q&A sessions, which we'll have after the presentations. Please type your questions in the Q&A portal because it's much, much easier for Antonella, the chair, to manage them through the Q&A portal than if you could type them in the chat. And I think this is time now to hand over to Antonella. Antonella, over to you.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you, everyone who's in the room. I can see colleagues and students who have joined us. Welcome to the first webinar of 2022. I know it's a bit late, but still, I think it's time to say Happy New Year. I'm hoping it's going to be a good one for everyone. So today I'm going to introduce our three speakers, and then they will present, as Miriam said, the research, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So I'm introducing the speaker in the order in which they are going to present, starting from Dr. Jenny Benham, who's a senior lecturer in medieval history at Cardiff University. Her research and teaching focuses on war, peace, and diplomacy between the year 500 and 1250. And she's also the author of a very recent book published from Manchester University Press entitled International Law in Europe between 700 and 1200. But you might have also been familiar with her previous study and previous research. I was a big fan of her book, Peacemaking in the Middle Ages, as well as having published extensively on medieval law, war, and diplomacy. So welcome, Jenny. Our second speaker for today is Dr. Alessandro Silvestri, who's a Beatrice de Pinot Fellow at the CSIC, the Institute Milai Fontanaus, who's also one of our, which is also one of our partners for this series. Alessandro's research focuses on Sicily and the Crown of Aragon in the late Middle Ages. with a particular focus on bureaucracy, information management, and finances. And Alessandro has also published extensively on those topics, including a monograph in 2018, but also various books and chapters, and is currently working on Sicilian taxation and on the first Aragonese war for Naples. So we're talking about the 1420s, and is editing a special issue that is going to come up with the European Review of History next year. And last but not least, with us today is Fabrizio Ansani, Dr. Fabrizio Ansani, who's a research fellow in early modern history at the Università degli Studi di Padova. And Fabrizio has worked extensively on innovations in artillery technology in Renaissance Italy, focusing on the economic impact of the local war industry. Fabrizio has also published extensively in international and national journals, exploring the effects of 15th century warfare, including the institution of permanent offices and the logistics of strategic material, and is currently working on a monograph on the trade in saltpeter, and also a book on the market in war horses. And obviously this has helped him to explore more broadly the political tension, diplomatic issues, and economic implications of the early modern military business. So it is a brief introduction to our speakers and their fascinating research that they're going to now tell us a little bit more about.
So, okay, hopefully you can all see the PowerPoint in front of you now. Thank you, Antonella, for that very kind introduction, and also thank you for this invitation to come here and share some of my research that I'm doing currently and that I have done over the last 4 years or so on a number of treaties surrounding the Mediterranean. Now, what I'm particularly interested in is perhaps what 12th century treaties can tell us about the war economy. There are lots of things, obviously, but I feel that in 10 minutes there is not enough time to tell you about everything, so I've made a kind of real selection. And I've chosen to focus on Genoa. Genoa is of special interest to me, in particular because in its archives survive a very large number of treaties with different entities. Those of the Latin West, those of the Latin East as well, Byzantium, various Muslim powers. And the advantage of focusing on Genoa then is that its diplomatic relations kind of radiated outwards in all directions, and this sets it apart from very many other Italian cities in this period. So in the few minutes that I have, I'm simply going to make 3 points. And the first of these are Genoa as a provider of military services. Now, the majority of Genoese treaties are contracts for the provision of military services in lots of different ways, but primarily in the form of transport, in the form of kind of manpower of lots of different ways. So not only fighting men to kind of board ships and so on and so forth. Supplies and also equipment. And this is then supplied to a range of rulers, political entities on a variety of military endeavors around the Mediterranean. And in return for these services, the Genoese consistently asked for the same things. And this is the kind of, sorry, excuse me. Sorry. So they consistently ask for the same thing. So the establishment of a trading settlement and a percentage, usually 1/3 of revenues in lands conquered, the privileged access to markets and rights for Genoese to trade freely, and also entitlement to redress in case of loss or damage to goods or to person. And you have some of the examples on the slide now. The first of these, this is a treaty that dates to 1101. It is a treaty with one of the leaders of the First Crusade. And this is following the capture of Antioch. The second one is the Treaty of Genoa from 1146 with Alfonso VII of Castile and Ramon Berenguer of Barcelona. And this was regarding the expedition to Almeria and Tortosa in 1147. And you can see from both of these first two that what was expected was a third share of the revenues, a kind of trading post. In the case of the 1146 treaty, it came with an oven, a bath, and even a good garden, which always makes me laugh. They weren't to pay any taxes or tolls, and then they kind of got the redress for injury to goods and people. And then the third treaty is a treaty from 1162 with the Emperor Frederick I. This is Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. And this concerns his intention to launch an expedition against the Kingdom of Sicily. And again, we can see that what was promised was a trading post with a church, a bath, an oven in any of the cities that they captured on this endeavor. They weren't to pay any, the Genoese were allowed not to have to pay any taxes or tolls in Sicily. They were given exclusive access to markets, the right to justice, redress through Genoese judges themselves, and also 1/4 of any movable property that they captured except precious stone. Now, I should hastily say that actually this endeavor never actually came to fruition. There was a treaty for its kind of execution nonetheless. Now, effectively then, what all of these demands did was, and all of these treaties did, was create or attempt to create a series of Genoese colonies that were dotted around the Mediterranean. And all of these were, of course, intended to increase the prosperity of the city of Genoa itself through trade. And so I guess I'm wondering how the Genoese could actually afford all of this. And this then is my kind of second point. And this colonization, if I may call it that, it clearly required massive generation of resources, both in terms of people, so manpower, but also goods. And clearly the city itself could not supply all of this. Those of you who are unfamiliar with Genoa and its geographical location, it has been described as, at least by one historian, as situated at the mouth of nothing. I think this is quite stark. I'm not sure that's quite true, but it is true that Genoa is surrounded by steep mountains, fairly rocky cliffs, very few flat surfaces. In the medieval period, it certainly had poor soil for growing also in its immediate kind of layout. But beyond the city lay fertile lands, major navigable rivers and ports, and hence then controlling this area was crucial. So this is the kind of very typical kind of contado model with, you know, the contado, the surrounding areas effectively supplying the city that he was serving. And this was then in kind of return for rights and protection within the city. But in terms of supply of hired manpower, it seems likely that this went a little bit further than just the surrounding areas. This can in fact be best seen not through a Genoese treaty, although there are some Genoese treaties that gives hint to this. But the best example that I have is a treaty between Venice and the Byzantine emperor from 1187. And there are a number of treaties in this period. The 1187 is just one such example, where they refer to what we might think of as recruitment officers. So Byzantine recruitment officers who were allowed to come into Italy to recruit manpower within Italian territory. So we know that actually this kind of supply of men, for example, is something that went beyond the immediate surrounding areas of some of the cities. And we can see this very clearly in the treaties, in some ways going beyond the actual jurisdictions of the cities, which in itself is, of course, interesting. There were also treaties and agreements with port towns along the coast to the west of Genoa, what we might think of as the region of Provence. And these types of treaties tend to again supply the Genoese with manpower, equipment, etc., in return for Genoese protection. And very frequently, these towns and ports paid in grain and in foodstuff. And this is very clearly laid out in the treaties. And it often also tied these minor kind of entities into contracts of about 10 years or so at a time. So these were kind of long-term commitments that were being made in order to supply, to give the resources to Genoa to kind of be able to provide for larger entities. So in effect, Genoa was kind of running, I hesitate to say it, but it's almost like a protection racket for smaller entities in order to kind of be able to supply more large-scale military services to larger entities. Then the city itself also had ways of kind of conjuring up resources. You could tax visiting merchants, of course, we see quite a lot of that. Settlers, there were small groups of settlers from other political entities, including England, incidentally. Also specific groups within the city. So, for example, Jews. So they were kind of asked to provide the wax for candles in the church and so on and so forth. And this then meant that the Genoese themselves were kind of able to focus on other things and didn't have to pay for what was actually quite everyday kind of things. So left them free to invest in other areas. But I guess the thing that I am most interested in is this kind of what we think of as privatization of their colonies. Public rights, taxes, dues, obligations, both within the city itself, usually when it was in dire need to settle debts for one of these military ventures or another that had kind of turned sour, perhaps. But also in those territories that they had conquered. And a clear example of this is how the Genoese share of Almeria, which I showed you some of those treaties concluded in the lead up to it in 1146. Once Almeria had been captured, it was leased out in 1149. It was leased out to a Genoese citizen by the name of Ottone di Buonvillani, for 30 years. And in return, Ottone had to donate 2 pallia annually to the Church of St. Lawrence in Genoa. And after the first 15 years, he should also pay annually to the commune 1/2 of all the import duties that he would be collecting in Almeria. And so this is quite a way of kind of getting a return on the investment that they had made when they actually conquered the city. And we can see similar examples to this one, although I think that the one for Almeria is a particularly good one, but we can see similar examples of this sort of privatization of various other Genoese settlements around the Mediterranean. For instance, in the Crusader states, we have a number of privatizations issues going on with the Embriaco family. Anyone wants to ask me about that, please do so afterwards. I think one of the things that this raises issue about is that distinction between the public and the private at this particular time. And this has quite a lot of implications for how we view authority and jurisdiction when conducting war or when conducting diplomacy. And for me, who work on international law, this is quite significant indeed. And if anyone wants to know more, please ask me about this at the end. Now, finally, then, I want to say something about compliance, and how to enforce these various treaties that had been concluded for the purpose of military services and so on, whether it was kind of gathering in the resources or whether it was kind of distributing them and so on. Now, it is clear that the Genoese could have to lay out significant amounts of money and resources in order to fulfill the obligations in very many of the treaties that they concluded. And most treaties ask for kind of part payments up front, of course. And the remainder then tended to be due at the point of delivery of equipment for the transport or at the point that a military campaign was kind of due to start, right? So there was a kind of way of ensuring that they weren't going to go on any military venture until most of the funds had actually been secured. And I say most because it's quite clear that very frequently it didn't actually cover the full cost. Examples of this then, well, it includes the treaties of 1146 for the capture of Almeria, as I've mentioned previously, but also the 1190 treaty with the French King Philip Augustus, for example, for the ships and transport of troops for the Third Crusade. This was another treaty where first there was a part payment upon the point that the initial treaty was concluded, and then a further payment before the transporting actually began. However, my favorite treatise on this issue actually relates to Sardinia, and this is I call this my little baby. Sardinia has become a real interest to me in the 12th century. It consisted of 4 entities, as you can see on the map now, each ruled by a prince who was referred to in the document as a judge. And competition between these rulers were fierce and involved both Genoa and its arch rival, the city of Pisa, who lent support, equipment, etc., in order for these various judges to kind of make and sustain their claims to rule. And some of these ventures went absolutely horribly wrong. And the Genoese had kind of various ways of ensuring that there was compliance with the financial commitments that they had made. So, for instance, in the 1160s, one of these judges from Sardinia, this is Barcelona of Almeria, he failed to pay back the money that had been invested by the Genoese. And the Genoese then swiftly retaliated by kidnapping him and refusing to allowing him to return to Almeria until adequate security had been made for the fulfillment of the obligations in the original treaty. And this then came in the form of another treaty, which was secured by 2 hostages, Barcelona's first wife and her brother, Pons de Bar. Similarly, in the 1180s, the Genoese used alliance building involving treaties with neighboring rulers on Sardinia. So if you look at Almeria, for example, we know that Calari was the neighboring ruler that they were most worried about. And so building an alliance with that one in order to enforce financial obligation was quite a good strategy. And it was, of course, cheap for the Genoese, didn't require any further outlay. And so this then we can show, with this we can show that the Genoese were very adept at financial management of the war economy and use diplomacy and treaties as a strategy of compliance and enforcement. Hope then that I have shown something about the many things that can be understood from looking at treaties and thinking about what the war economy might be in relation to how diplomacy was conducted. And I guess I'm hoping that more people will go and have a look at them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you very much. And we now have Alessandro.
Okay, first, many thanks to Antonella, Esther, and all the other organizers for having me, or better, us here today. And also, thanks to Flora for her technical support. Today we'll give just a brief chat about my current research, and I mostly will focus on a specific case study. So we start immediately, so that I will try to finish by 10 minutes. In 1409, King Martin I of Sicily passed away, and his father Martin I of Aragon inherited the island. Following his death in 1410, Ferdinand I of Trastamara was elected as the new ruler of the Crown of Aragon, a conglomerate of territories which also included Sicily. Under his son and successor, Alfonso V of Aragon, called the Magnanimous, the island acquired a crucial role to support the Mediterranean expansion of the Aragonese. De facto, Sicily became the strategical base for the invasion of southern Italy and the conquest of Naples, both in terms of transfer of funding and movements of men and supplies to keep the army and the fleet. Surprisingly, scholarship so far neglected the role of Sicily in this process, with no specific study on the topic. The only exception is an old article by Carmelo Trasselli, who stated that Alfonso the Magnanimous brutally exploited the island's resources, thus bankrupting the kingdom and destroying its economy, while Stephen Epstein, in his very famous work on Sicilian economy, suggested that the island's contribution to war was not comparable to the financial support by the other components of the Crown of Aragon. Yet, we can say that Trasselli was not in the end wrong when he suggested that Alfonso the Magnanimous actually used the island's incomes and royal demise for war funding, and probably even underestimated the contribution of Sicily. The kingdom, as later discussed by Harry Beresque and Stephen Epstein, for example, actually had such a financial strength and resilience that it could bear the cost of war. Through analyzing the Sicilian treasury's accounts in the 5 years before the conquest of Naples of 1442, we can see a significant increase of the treasurer's income, which produced a huge amount of about 7,000 once, the currency of Sicily, about 80% of which was used to fund the Napolitan campaign, not merely through direct transfers of money into the central treasury of the Crown of Aragon, but also by maintaining and supplying the army and through paying debts of the Crown and promissory notes of Alfonso the Magnanimous. In addition to this, Sicily's support to the conquest of Naples also took the form of a continuous movement of weight, weapons, horses, and other supplies from the Sicilian ports to the Italian mainland, whereas incomes from customs and grain exports, which do not appear in the treasury's accounts, were also used to pay debts in favor of merchants who transported goods, bankers who lent money, and ship owners who rented their vessels and barges. Although the most part of incomes traditionally originated from indirect taxation, alienation, royal demands, and loans, this phase also attests the growing role of direct taxation. At this stage, direct taxation, which was called subventio generalis or colletta, was still occasional, albeit strictly regulated according to an old Swabian regulation, later updated under James II of Aragon. In essence, monarchs could impose the general subsidy only for specific circumstances, which I have here summarized: defensive war or internal rebellion, ransom of the king or his heirs, knighting of the sovereign or his closest family members, marriage of the king's sister, daughters, and heirs. Yet, laws are meant to be broken indeed, or at least circumvented, in particular when the rulers were in constant need of money for facing war. This is the case of the tax collection organized in Sicily in 1441-42, which was created with the specific purpose of funding the Aragonese armies and giving the final blow to the Angevin resistance in Naples. Thus, it was a case which is outside the regulation of Sicily, of taxation, direct taxation in Sicily. An example of which I will discuss in the next 5 minutes, and which shows in practice how Alfonso and his viceroys, as well as his Sicilian officers, were able to quickly collect a huge, significant amount of income and use it for war. In the last months of 1441, Sicilian authorities started a broad inquisition against coin counterfeiting and usury, which involved both the demesne and the baronial cities and towns. Unfortunately, the survival records do not give many details on this accusation, which most probably concerned the alteration of the coin known as gigliato at the local level and targeted bankers and moneylenders of the crown, as well as town councils. In Palermo, for instance, the banker Pietro Gaetano, with origins from Pisa, and the high officer Giovanni Tedesco were accused of usury and taken to trial. We know that the representative of Palermo immediately proposed the viceroy to pay a general fine, which was to be supposed to be paid by the entire urban community in exchange for the king's pardon. Although Alfonso the Magnanimous initially rejected this proposal, stating that it was unfair, and I quote, that the entire city has to pay for the crimes and abuses of single persons, and that the poor and the innocent has to pay and contribute because of the abuse of the rich criminal. He finally grabbed the opportunity to collect this unexpected extra amount, and by the end of 1442, the Palermo citizens paid 1,200 once, which were materially transferred in cash with the galley of Salvatore Soreda to the sovereign in Italy. The same amount is also listed among the expenses of the Sicilian treasurer. Advised by the Sicilian Royal Council, the monarch extended this fine, or taxa as they called it, to the entire island. Its payment would have guaranteed the king's pardon to all the Sicilian towns and cities. In January 1442, a group of 6 royal officers was thus entrusted to collect this subvention, each according to a specific tabula taxarum, tax table, like this example you can see here, listing the amount due by each town and city or territory. Yet this collector was a total fiasco. For instance, this officer, Antonio de Micheletto, entrusted with the collection of 1,015 once, only received 16 once, about 1% of the entire sum. This fiasco probably originated from the fact that the representatives of the urban centers were waiting for the verdict from the judicial court before paying any sum to the king. The solution of the crown was to replace this fine with a general subsidy, through paying which all the Sicilian urban centers would have been granted, and I quote again, the royal pardon for usury, falsification, and alteration of coins. This compromise did not only protect cities and towns from being taxed twice in a year, in the sense that they wanted to avoid to pay the fine and a subvention, but also helped the monarch to increase the expected income. Because for the general subsidy, there were also payments from clergy and aristocracy. Moreover, the monarch obtained this subsidy gratuito modo, namely, he could use its income outside the direct taxation regulation and according to his own will, namely, and I quote, to hire and pay the magnificent Niccolò Piccinino, strenuous and famous captain of men-at-arms, who comes to this realm of Naples to support and serve our illustrious lordship with 10,000 knights and 6,000 foot soldiers, so that our lordship will obtain in a short time his certain victory and the total extermination of all those who will try to oppose him. Indeed, a lot of money were needed to recruit Niccolò Piccinino and his army, and at the same time, however, the victory would have been also useful to the kingdom of Sicily because, and I quote again, all the oppression and vexation experienced by the kingdom would have been finally come to an end. This time, the Sicilian viceroy ordered 13 different officers to travel across the island and collect the amounts needed to fund Niccolò Piccinino's army, each one again according to a specific tabula taxarum. In each town, the officer delegated the local authority to collect taxes by direct or indirect taxation. It was not important. And to speed up the operation, however, they could force the wealthiest men of each city to pay in advance the entire amount due by the urban community. this time, the money collection worked properly, and in a few weeks, the royal officers amassed more than 4,000 once. And if we add this sum to the amounts previously paid by Palermo and other barons and ecclesiastical institutions, this means that this money collection produced a total income of 5,794 once, corresponding to about 43.7% of the entire income of the Treasury. Although we do not have the Treasury's accounting book of the year, the existing summary of those accounts gives us a rough idea of how the Treasury spent a total amount of almost 15,000 once, which also included obviously the income from the direct taxation discussed today. This summary shows that an amount of about 4,000 once was actually sent to the Crown of Aragon, to the Treasury of the Crown of Aragon. Although I cannot say how this money was used, because I didn't have the possibility to check the existing records in Valencia, and there is no mention anywhere else of this payment of the Piccinino's army. We, however, can conclude by saying that the contribution of Sicily to the conquest of Naples was fundamental, both in terms of financial support, as I discussed today, but also provision and supplies, as well as for the maintenance of the fleet, aspects that I've already touched today, but that still need to be investigated. I'm done.
Thank you, Alessandro. Thank you very much. And last but not least, Fabrizio.
Here I am.
Excellent.
And okay. Okay, here we go. So, good evening to everyone, and many thanks to the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean and the Woolf Institute for the invitation. As you can see, this paper will focus on a different kind of military resource, that is, a raw material. Okay, perfect. A history of the late medieval saltpeter trade is yet to be written, even though the commodity constituted the irreplaceable component of the black powder, indispensable for waging war at the time of the early modern artillery revolution. The potassium nitrate undoubtedly represented one of the most strategic materials of the pre-industrial age, comparable in importance to modern petroleum. Indeed, no regime could do without it, and none could get enough. The practical use of the mineral affected every aspect of the 15th century warfare, including the output of military industry and the possibility of technical improvements, the innovation in field tactics, and the enhancement of logistical planning. Consequently, the dependency on saltpeter was a common concern to governments, which regarded its provision, according to a 16th century Venetian officer, as the problem that matters most and more important than money. To date, Europe has always been considered as dependent on the commodity imported from the Levant for the early development of its gunpowder age. Scholars of medieval military technology have particularly insisted on the importance of the geological deposits of India, which offered the best prospects for commercial saltpeter production due to the peculiar soil characteristics and the hotter climatic conditions. Nonetheless, this portrait is based on surprisingly little research. It does not take account of geopolitical issues and economic factors, and it evidently results from the historical memory of the colonial past of the subcontinent. British India was in fact the largest exporter of saltpeter in the world until the beginnings of the 20th century, shipping something like 19,000 tons of materials per year and providing the English army with an almost unlimited ammunition supply. However, the question is, did the Indian saltpeter reach Europe in the Middle Ages? When Vasco da Gama discovered the Cape route in 1498, Portuguese explorers were fully informed of the richness of the Indies. Prices and quality of species were described in detail in the journal of this first voyage, which also records the innumerable goods that were sold in various cities of that vast ocean. Potassium nitrate was not included among those precious commodities. It was not even catalogued in the cargo inventories of the numerous vessels that returned to Lisbon in the following years. The first appearance of Indian saltpeter in Portuguese documentation came dated only to 1515, when a shipbuilder noted it in a list of items needed by the fleet and available in one of the neighboring states. In his very words, it was the most important thing of them all. Of course, another question arises from this long delay. If the regional market was so flourishing, how did Europeans fail to notice it soon after their arrival? The answer could lie in the lack of knowledge about Indian geography, as saltpeter was mainly extracted in inland areas, which were quite unknown during this period. Moreover, the domestic trade was controlled by indigenous authorities. To obtain war materials and counterbalance the military disadvantage of the colonies, Portuguese viceroys had often to resort to diplomatic talks with the Indian powers. Given the highly unstable situation, it's not surprising that saltpeter could not be exported to the far motherland until the late 16th century. Before then, it was used solely in the gunpowder mills established in the Estado da India to supply royal ships and coastal fortifications. The fact that Portuguese ignored the existence of a large intra-Asian market in saltpeter does not imply that the Indian commodity had never left the subcontinent over the late medieval period. Considering their political and cultural ties with the merchants that controlled the spice route in the Red Sea, it's likely that Egyptian Mamluks managed to access the resource, acquiring the nitrate to foster their artillery manufacture. The interest in imported saltpeter shown by these Muslim rulers undoubtedly reflected their increasing involvement in the transit trade between India and Europe, but also posed an ostensible threat to those Christian sovereigns who had to depend on their long-time arrivals for the regular supply of indispensable war material. Given this hypothesis, any inopportune conflict could compromise the diffusion and advancement of the European gunpowder technology, making saltpeter an extremely costly, extremely rare commodity. Did the impasse represent a bottleneck in the Mediterranean circulation of the Indian nitrate? And what about the mounting tensions and the trading conflicts between foreign merchants and local bureaucrats? Were negotiations really necessary? It is It is true that many treaties were signed between Mamluk sultans and Italian states, for example, and there is no doubt that the agreements regulated every aspect of international commerce, impacting on the trade in pepper, cotton, and alkali. The significant privileges granted to Venetian operators in the 15th century, however, did not concern saltpeter business, and the mineral was also excluded from the official tariffs, which established fiscal norms for all the exported merchandise. Genoese archives are silent on this issue too. Both cargo lists and financial records do not provide a single evidence of bulk purchases of nitrate in the ports of Alexandria and Rosetta. If occasional transactions were made, they certainly lacked continuity and were quantitatively modest. Considering all these sources as a trustworthy representation of the contents of the Levant trade, it must be said that Indian saltpeter definitely remained in Egyptian arsenals and warehouses, if it's ever arrived here at all. Furthermore, Mamluk seems to have preferred a nearer emporium, that is, Istanbul. This is not a theory, as several studies have demonstrated that saltpeter was abundantly extracted in Anatolia and traded in the Near East. The market, however, was strictly regulated. The Ottoman divan regarded saltpeter manufacture as a state monopoly. Central offices and provincial governments organized the production chain, financed the business person, and ordered their subjects to craft gunpowder. To protect an expanding military industry, the mineral was also included among the prohibited goods. Saltpeter smuggling to a Christian enemy was even punished with the death penalty. Although they were promulgated quite often by religious authorities, these bans were quite ineffective. Merchants were easily lured into exporting war materials, and documents illustrated a continuous exchange of metals, copper, steel, on both sides of the border. But again, saltpeter disappears from European documentation, which usually provides a substantial information on early modern Turkish economy. The repeated wars that destabilized the area probably discouraged overseas military entrepreneurs from acquiring local nitrates, but a fundamental question remains unanswered. Where did the saltpeter utilized in the West come from? A large number of primary sources, state records, diplomatic correspondences, merchant account books which dated from the last decades of the 14th to the first half of the 16th century, agree on the existence of a roaring saltpeter trade in Italy, especially in the south part of the peninsula. In those regions, the peculiar features of the limestone rock allowed the extraction of the nitrates, unearthed in the cave village that characterized the rural landscape. Collected by a small team of peasants, the mineral was owned and sold by powerful barons, city artisans, and on-ground businessmen. Government interventions in the nitrate market was surprisingly modest, even in the elaboration of a regulatory framework. State authorities implemented specific measures to locate new sources of mineral supply within national borders and controlled exclusively the commercialization of the product, granting or refusing export licenses as they did with many other raw materials. To obtain such permission, Renaissance rulers were often compelled to enter diplomatic negotiation with exporting countries, especially allied ones. High-level talks over saltpeter procurement demonstrate the importance of raw material diplomacy in the late Middle Ages, but also stress the important assistance provided by capitalist elites to gather information and advance payments, dispatch goods, and mobilize resources. Regarded as one of the principal opportunities which resulted from a continuous state of military preparedness, the investment in potassium nitrate was particularly relevant to the interactions between princes and entrepreneurs. Persuaded by profit motive, businessmen guaranteed a constant material support to the grand strategies of their rulers. This backing, however, should be treated with some caution. The coexistence of a supply channel entrusted to ambassadors only clearly illustrated that the provision of the mineral was considered too critical to be solely driven by market forces. Pragmatic and prudent, this approach was also adopted by those European sovereigns who greatly needed Italian saltpeter. The international trade in the mineral increased sharply in the second half of the 15th century, thanks to the contribution of the largest banks of the time. The firms of the Medici, the Strozzi, and the Spannocchi were involved in various ways in the distribution of the commodity, which was regularly exchanged in London, Montpellier, Dubrovnik, and Bruges. Venetian ships also carried vast quantities of potassium nitrate in Lisbon, several decades before the first arrival of the Indian merchandise. Considering the ease of access to this domestic source, the continental diffusion of the artillery technology had to be undoubtedly favored by the large availability of natural potassium nitrate. In conclusion, it seems fair to say that late medieval Europe was self-sufficient in saltpeter production. Although the trade in common raw materials in the Near East had increased considerably over that period, the old continent was not dependent on nor involved in nitrate imports from Egypt, Anatolia, or India. But aside from tearing down this geographical myth, Archival research suggests a reconsideration of the peculiar status of this commodity. Saltpeter was not a common object of trade. Its procurement was concerned with diplomatic talks, defense issues, and economic interdependence. These were probably the reason behind its limited circulation, apparently restricted to regional blocks and trading spaces determined by geographical proximity, religious belief, and technological uniformity. Unlike other war materials, saltpeter was not regularly exchanged in the vast Mediterranean market, and only in spite of a skyrocketing demand in Europe and Asia as well. Only the proto-globalization and the military revolutions of the modern age forced those different areas to interact and compete to secure potassium nitrate, accelerating the mobilization and the consumption of strategic goods. But that's another story, of course. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for your amazing contributions. So I just realized that we are already at 10 to 6. As you will know, at 6, our live streaming on Facebook will end. However, if there are other questions and our speakers don't mind, we can still remain online and answer those questions, even if everything is not live streamed after 6. Having said that, I would like to remind our attendees and our audience, if you could please include your questions or comments in the Q&A in the Q&A box, and you will see the icon at the bottom of your screen. That would be really useful and helpful. Please don't include it in the chat because it's a bit difficult to follow both. So if you could include it in the Q&A, it would be very much appreciated. So while giving people time to type their questions in the Q&A, I guess I can start. So first of all, thank you, as I said, to our speakers. It was fascinating to hear all your views, all your case studies. And I was wondering, I've got individual questions for individual speakers, but I wonder whether I can ask a question that everyone could address. And it's interesting, obviously, to see the different type of records that you used. But I was wondering whether there is anything that, because okay, this question starts from Alessandro mentioning something that is at the moment in Valencia and you didn't manage to access to find out a little bit more. But I was wondering whether in general there are other records alongside those that you have explored that might give us more of an insight, and whether that's part of your future research or something that you think it might be embedded at some point and might offer or enhance the perspective that you are already giving us. I don't know who would like to start.
I'm happy to start.
Thanks,
I probably have the least records of everyone, but I will say that of course there are a number of other records that could be used. So we have narratives such as the Annals of Genoa, for example, which provide that kind of the historical context and the historical background to a lot of this. And there are a number of other narratives across Europe also that can kind of enable us to follow some of these military expeditions and some of the ways in which the recruitments and the treaties were made. Then there are a number of treaties that are actually held at other entities that are not in the Genoese archives. Exactly why, I'm not sure. That's something that I may think of at a point in the future. But they can also add to this. And then, of course, other kind of diplomatic documents. So in Genoa, for example, we have notarial kind of roles, for example, and they exist only for certain years in this earliest period. But some of them do give us various kind of insights to these documents, and in particular to those really where we're kind of thinking about that privatization issue, taxation of the citizens and so on, kind of the raising of funds. But it also gives an insight into the kind of the workings of it, that public-private issue that I was talking about in terms of authority. So there's quite a lot of material there that you could explore in lots of different ways. And I should say the treatise in particular, very little work has been done on them, and then comparing it to some of this other material. So there is a lot of potential there.
Thank you, Jenny.
Okay, I'll go second. Well, obviously, like for me, it's a bit different because I work on especially like 14th, 15th centuries. So luckily, we have plenty of documentation, and let's say that probably the main problem is in particular the disappearance of the Neapolitan archives. The entire documentation is de facto gone, but for a few, for about 10-15 registers preserved in Barcelona. On the other hand, the archives of Barcelona, l'Archivo della Corona d'Aragó, and the Archive of Valencia and of Palermo are very rich, and sometimes you have like the sensation you just have to stop researching and write something, because I mean there is too much material. And probably the Archive of Palermo is a classical example of neglected archive, because there are no scholars working there, despite there are about 1,000 registers for the 15th century, the most part of which are untouched and stored in the archives, waiting to be open, hopefully in the future by someone.
Thanks, Alessandro.
Yeah, I have to take a look at the Palermitan archives too, as there is so many references in the local archives to saltpeter export in Italy and Europe, especially in Venice, but also Lisbon and London. And I'm trying to make a comparison between Italy and other European countries. So, well, I already took a look to Burgundian, Spanish, French, or English documentation which regards war expenditure or supply of the army. Well, there is seriously a lot of material with a lot of potential in many archives in Italy, in Europe, in Italy. So, well, I think I can't be able to take a look to all of this documentation, but I hope to discuss with somebody else which is looking to the same documentation.
Brilliant, thank you. I like the fact that I think we are giving all, well, the people in the audience, and I can see there are lots of students as well, new ideas, perhaps in archives to go and look at. So that's fantastic.